The old espresso machine groaned to life in the corner of the cafe, its familiar metal whir filling the quiet space just before the register let out a sharp, unforgiving beep that cut through the low murmur of morning conversations, and the cashier, sounding bored rather than unkind, announced, "Declined." The woman at the front of the line, her blonde hair perfectly smoothed into place, and a gold watch gleaming on her wrist, went completely still for a heartbeat, then scrambled for composure as she begged the cashier to try again, her voice shaking slightly while her manicured hands fumbled through a designer purse that suddenly seemed bottomless. Behind her, Ray Sullivan shifted his weight from one aching foot to the other, watching panic flicker across her face with a horrible familiarity, because it was the same feeling that had punched through his own chest just yesterday when his card had been rejected at the grocery store, forcing him to pretend he had another card at home and walk away empty-handed. He looked down at the crumpled $20 bill in his hand, the last of his cash, the fragile barrier between his daughter, Bluey, and 2 or 3 days without proper food, and felt his stomach tighten. The cashier sighed and reminded the woman that there was a line forming, her tone making it clear that the clock was moving and patience was not unlimited. Before Ray could talk himself out of it, he stepped forward and told the cashier it was fine, that he would cover the bill, already holding out the 20 as if it didn't represent the difference between food and hunger. And when the woman turned to look at him, startled, their eyes locked for a second longer than politeness required. She started to refuse, insisting that she couldn't accept such generosity, but he gently interrupted, saying that they all had rough mornings and that she could let him help this once, even though he knew full well that nobody had ever stepped in for him this way. The lie made her humiliation feel a little less sharp, and she studied his tired face as if committing it to memory, searching the sincerity in his eyes before whispering a soft, almost disbelieving, "Thank you," telling him he had no idea what it meant. Ray only nodded, ordered a small cup of water because he could no longer afford even the cheapest coffee, and ignored the gnawing hunger in his own belly, soothed instead by the strange fullness in his chest. As he turned to leave, the woman's voice called after him, asking his name. "Ray," he said, keeping it simple. "Ray Sullivan." Her expression shifted as if someone had switched on a light behind her eyes, a faint recognition cutting through the embarrassment. "You used to work at Nexus Innovations," she said slowly, and he stilled, feeling the air go thicker around him as he admitted that he had, at least until 3 weeks ago, when everything had fallen apart. She murmured that she saw and thanked him again, more formally this time, calling him Mr. Sullivan, and he gave a polite nod before stepping out into the sunlight, clutching his empty wallet and the half-formed plan to visit 4 more shops, drop off 4 more resumes, and endure 4 more rounds of polite rejection. What he didn't see, as the cafe door closed behind him, was the woman standing absolutely motionless at the window, with a cooling latte untouched in front of her, staring after him as if she'd just seen a ghost. Clara Winters, CEO of Nexus Innovations, whispered to herself that after 6 months of searching, she had finally seen him with her own eyes. Her hand trembled as she called her assistant and ordered Marcus to pull everything related to Ray Sullivan's termination, files, emails, security footage, every scrap of documentation, because the man she had watched just now, the one who stayed late to help interns, who had tutored the security guard's kid in math, who held patents worth millions and still carried himself quietly, did not fit the story she had been handed about a thief who had walked away. Ray walked the 12 blocks home instead of taking the bus, counting each step as another small refusal to waste the coins he needed for food, his landlord's sharp messages piling up on his phone as the clock ticked toward eviction in 3 days. That night he opened a single can of soup, split it carefully between 2 bowls, and told Bluey to eat up while he pretended his own appetite was fine, swallowing only thin broth when she wasn't looking. When she asked, with puzzled eyes, why they didn't have milk anymore, He forced a smile and promised they would get some tomorrow, knowing there was no money left and no guarantee at all. The next few days blurred into a haze of job applications, closed doors, and the hollow ache of an empty cupboard, until by Thursday he found himself standing outside the gleaming Nexus Tower, where he had spent 18 months mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms, his stomach twisting from 2 days without real food after giving Bluey the last spoonfuls of peanut butter that morning. Because even at his lowest, her hunger would always come before his. Inside those sparkling glass walls, Clara Winters was locked in her 5th emergency meeting of the week, her voice clipped and icy as she declared that what had happened was beyond disgraceful, that Dennis Fitzgerald had fabricated evidence and framed an innocent man to shield his nephew, and when a junior executive timidly mentioned that they had prepared reinstatement papers for Ray's janitorial position, Clara's eyes flashed with something close to fury. She snapped that handing him back a mop would not erase what they had done, and when she fully saw his real personnel file for the first time, his degrees, his patents, his designs for water purification systems that could save millions of lives in underserved communities, she went quiet, whispering in disbelief that they had forced the mind behind this technology to clean toilets. Friday morning, Ray knelt on the worn floor in front of Bluey, helping her with her shoes and reminding her gently to eat all of her lunch at school, and when she asked why he was making such a big deal of it, he just asked her to promise she would, unable to bring himself to say that he had no idea what would be in the cupboards by tonight. After she left, he stared at the silence in the apartment, at the bills stacked on the table, and finally swallowed the chunk of pride stuck in his throat long enough to walk to the food bank and join the line that wrapped around the block, each step forward scraping at his dignity more than his hunger ever could. When someone called his name, he turned automatically, expecting a volunteer with a clipboard, but instead found himself looking at Marcus Webb, the HR director from Nexus, standing there in an expensive suit and an expression that mixed discomfort with urgency. Marcus explained that Miss Winters had been trying to reach him all week, that he hadn't answered his phone, and Ray pulled the dead, useless device from his pocket, remembering that the electricity, and with it the ability to charge anything, had been cut off the day before. "She knows the truth," Marcus said, words tumbling out in a rush, as if he needed Ray to hear them before he lost the courage. "She has been digging through everything since Monday. She hasn't slept more than a couple of hours in days." When Ray asked in confusion about the cafe, Marcus nodded and confirmed that the woman whose card had been declined, the one he had given his last $20 to, had been Clara herself. He explained that when she realized what he had done, handing over the last of his cash to help her, not knowing she was the same person who had signed off on his termination, she had broken down and told Marcus to find Ray Sullivan, even if it meant searching every street in the city. The drive back to Nexus felt dreamlike. Ray rode in the front seat, staring at the building as it came into view, remembering every square inch of that lobby floor he had polished to a shine, every corner he had scrubbed without anyone ever learning his name. This time, security waved him through with deference instead of suspicion. Employees paused to stare and whisper, and the elevator rose past the basement and janitorial levels, past the crowded cubicles, straight up to the executive floor he had only ever glimpsed when the doors accidentally opened on the wrong level. When the elevator doors slid apart, Clara stood with her back to him, framed by a wall of windows, and the city skyline burning bright behind her. Without turning, she asked quietly if he knew why she had built the company, her tone more reflective than proud, and he answered honestly that he thought he did, at least from the speeches he'd heard and the materials he'd read. She turned then, and he recognized the woman from the cafe, though something in her posture had shifted from frazzled to composed, her expression steady and almost vulnerable as she walked toward him. She told him that he had never been a test to her, but rather a reminder, a living example of what decency still looked like when the world was crumbling, and admitted that he had given her his last dollars, while she had presided over a system that had repaid him with nothing but injustice. She said she intended to fix that, not with empty apologies or generic HR gestures, but with actions that matched the weight of what he had lost. In a low, controlled voice, Clara explained that her CFO had vanished the week before with $2 million of company money, and that the board was ready to sacrifice her position to protect themselves. Her personal accounts had been frozen pending investigation, her reputation questioned, and in the middle of that chaos, she had come face to face with the man her company had quietly abandoned to protect a thief. She told him that she had spent 5 sleepless nights reviewing every email, every piece of footage, every document connected to his case, and that what she had found had sickened her. On the night of his termination, he had gone without food so his daughter could eat. He had lied at the dinner table so she wouldn't know the fridge was empty, and he had stood in a food bank line that very morning for the first time in his life, all because a senior executive had decided a janitor would make the perfect scapegoat. She grabbed a folder from her desk, pulled up a recording on the large screen, and asked him to watch. The timestamp blinking on the footage read 11:47 p.m. on his last day at Nexus, and the security camera showed Dennis Fitzgerald entering the locker room, glancing around to make sure he was alone, and then slipping the missing laptop into Ray's locker with practiced ease. Clara's voice hardened as she pointed out that Dennis had planted it himself, that the supposed proof used to fire Ray had been manufactured from the start. She told him that they had footage of Dennis's nephew stealing it from the executive floor, and that Ray had simply been convenient, an invisible worker in a blue uniform who cleaned up after everyone and never caused trouble. Ray felt his knees threaten to buckle as the truth settled in, realizing that he had not simply been unlucky or careless, but deliberately framed, and he asked in a strained voice how she had learned about his degrees and patents when the only role he had ever been given there involved a mop and a cart. Clara opened another file, this one thicker, and explained that 6 months earlier she had overheard him helping an intern who had spilled coffee on his presentation. Instead of just mopping the floor, Ray had reconstructed the intern's complex data models from memory, improving them in the process. She clicked to another piece of footage showing him tutoring the security guard's teenage son in calculus late at night, then another of him improvising a fix for a faulty ventilation system on the 4th floor, using nothing but a paperclip and a rubber band after maintenance, had insisted it would take days and thousands of dollars. She showed screenshots of the small encouragement notes he left for the night shift, the record of him giving his lunch to the veteran who slept outside their building. And when Ray finally whispered that she had been watching him all along, she answered softly that she had been trying to understand why someone with his mind and heart had been content to stay in the shadows. If Ray's story of quiet sacrifice, unfair downfall, and unexpected justice moved you, and if you believe the world needs more people who choose kindness even when they have nothing left, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who could use a reminder that decency still matters, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more emotional cinematic stories of second chances, hidden heroes, and lives transformed by a single selfless act. Clara's gaze drifted back to the screen that still showed Ray recalibrating a system with a few strokes of a pen, and she said quietly that this was a man who could redesign their entire building's energy grid on the back of a napkin during his break, and then go back to mopping floors as if it meant nothing. And Ray felt his throat constrict as he swallowed hard and admitted that after his wife, Michelle, died, something inside his mind had simply shut down. That blueprints had become landmines because every time he looked at a schematic, he saw her hand resting on his shoulder in encouragement. Every equation dragged up the echo of her laughter when he got excited about solving it, so he had chosen the simplest work he could find, repetitive tasks and physical motions that didn't require the kind of thinking that hurt. Clara turned toward the window for a moment. The city reflected faintly in the glass, and told him that her own mother had died when she was 15 in a car crash with no warning and no chance to say goodbye, and that she had buried her grief under endless work, because pausing for even a breath felt like risking drowning in it. When she looked back at him, her eyes softer now, she told him that despite everything he had not drowned, that he had somehow managed to turn that same pain into compassion, and that every person in the building who had ever hit rock bottom seemed to know his name. Her voice gentled as she told him that the intern he had helped late one night was now leading their Pacific Division, and mentioned him in every speech, and that the security guard's son he had tutored in calculus had gotten into MIT because of those quiet lessons in the lobby after hours. Ray tried to shrug it off, saying he had just done what anyone would have done in his position, but Clara shook her head and corrected him with firm certainty, saying that he had done what Ray Sullivan would do, the man who had designed a water purification system that might save millions of lives, and who used his own broken pieces to recognize exactly where other people were splitting apart. She slid a folder across the desk and asked him to open it, and inside he found an offer letter that did not mention a mop, a bucket, or the word janitor anywhere. The position was Director of Sustainable Development, with an annual salary of $150,000, full benefits, flexible hours specifically structured so he could be present for his daughter, and a $50,000 signing bonus intended to stabilize the ground under his feet after months of free fall. Ray blinked, tears burning his eyes until the words blurred, and he whispered that it felt like charity. But Clara shook her head again and said that this was not charity, it was justice and sound business sense, that his patents and designs could save the company millions while also changing lives far beyond their walls, and that, truthfully, he was worth 10 times the salary they were starting with. But they would begin here and build from there. When he asked in a rough voice what had happened to Dennis, she told him without a trace of regret that Dennis had been arrested that morning along with his nephew, and that both were now facing charges of fraud and theft, then watched his hands tremble around the offer letter as he admitted that he did not know if he could still do the kind of work she was asking for, that he was afraid the part of his brain that had once danced with equations and blueprints might be gone for good. Clara walked around the desk, took his shaking hands gently in hers, and told him that they would move at whatever pace he needed, that if he could only handle an hour of focused design a day they would start with that he would have a team to support him, and that they would put whatever accommodations in place he required. She added quietly that his mind was working exactly as it should after what he had lived through, that it had learned empathy through pain, and that this was not damage but growth, not a flaw but an expansion of who he was. That evening, she insisted on driving him home herself, explaining that she needed to apologize not only to him but to his daughter as well, because her company had failed Bluey's father, and that failure landed on the shoulders of a little girl who had done nothing wrong. The sleek Mercedes looked almost absurd parked outside his worn-down apartment building, and the stairs creaked in protest as they climbed them together. "Daddy!" Bluey burst out of the neighbor's flat as soon as she spotted him in the hallway, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, as she ran to throw her arms around his waist. And then she peered around him at Clara with unabashed curiosity and asked who the pretty lady was. Clara immediately knelt so they were eye to eye, and introduced, herself as someone who worked with her dad now, and when Bluey's eyes widened and she asked if that meant her father had a job again, Clara smiled and said he had a very good one because he was extraordinary, glancing up at Ray in quiet affirmation. Inside the small apartment, she took in the neatly kept living room with its mismatched furniture, the walls decorated with Bluey's crayon drawings rather than expensive prints, and the single worn engineering textbook on the shelf whose faded cover spoke of years of use and long nights of study. Ray pulled an old notebook from a drawer and told her there was something he wanted to show her. He laid it open on the table to reveal page after page of sketches and formulas, solar arrays, water purification tablets, materials diagrams, and explained that these had been his projects before Michelle's death: concepts for low-cost solar panels, portable purification units for disaster zones, and building materials created from recycled plastics that could make housing both cheaper and more sustainable. He admitted that he had never been able to finish them in his grief, but that maybe with this second chance, he could finally bring them to life. Clara's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages, recognizing the elegance in his designs, and she told him that what she was holding in her hands could change everything about how they approached energy and infrastructure. From the floor, Bluey looked up from her coloring and told Clara that her mother had always said her daddy was going to save the world someday, and Clara smiled gently and replied that she had been right. In the weeks that followed, Ray returned to the world of ideas slowly and carefully, beginning with a single hour a day in a bright office Clara had set up just for him, with a large window overlooking the park where he had once taken Bluey to feed the ducks when they still had the energy for those small joys. On the first day, he sat there unable to do more than stare at the blank screen, fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. On the second day, he managed a rough diagram. By the end of the first week, he had re-engineered his original water tablet prototype with improvements he would never have imagined during his darkest years. Clara often stopped by, not to hover or micromanage, but simply to be present, sometimes bringing coffee she paid for herself, sometimes dropping off a snack for Bluey when she visited after school. One afternoon, when Ray told her she did not have to keep showing up because he understood she was busy running a company, she answered with a small, sincere smile that she was not checking on him at all. She was learning from him, learning how someone rebuilt after shattering, how to recognize people for who they truly were, rather than for the job titles printed on their name badges. Her words settled over the quiet room like something fragile and important, and for the first time in years, Ray felt a stir of something in his chest that was not dread or numbness, but the faint spark of belief in himself. On another evening, he sat at his desk while Bluey colored beside him and spoke aloud about a new housing concept he was wrestling with, mentioning modular structures and interlocking panels without much expectation that anyone was really listening. Bluey looked up, tapped her crayon against her drawing, and suggested that if the houses snapped together like her building blocks at school, then families could add rooms when they needed them, and nothing would have to be thrown away. Something clicked in his mind so sharply he almost heard it. He returned to his sketchpad and began muttering about zero waste and fully reusable modules, and then turned back to his daughter with a grin, calling her a genius as he swept her up into his arms and spun her in a laughing circle around the room. When he set her down, breathless and grinning, he caught Clara watching from the doorway, her expression unguarded and warm, and she told him quietly that it seemed talent ran in the family, that Bluey had inherited more than just his eyes. That night, Ray did not keep working because of deadlines or fear of failure. He kept going because, for the first time since Michelle's death, his mind felt genuinely alive, as if a dam that had been holding him back for years had finally cracked. Ideas spilled from his hands in a relentless flow: designs for modular housing, notes on sustainable materials, tweaks to the purification system. And Clara remained nearby as a steady presence, ordering takeout when they lost track of the time, refilling his coffee mug, and occasionally offering a comment that shifted the way he saw a problem. Her insights were precise and technically sharp, the kind of observations that could redraw an entire schematic with a single sentence, and when he finally said that she had trained as an engineer, it was too obvious to be a question. She admitted with a slightly sheepish grin that she had studied at MIT before detouring into business, and that she had been reading his patents for months because she found them beautiful in a way most spreadsheets were not. Ray's eyes drifted to the photograph on his desk, the one of Michelle that Clara had quietly made sure was there on his first day back, And he told her that Michelle had always insisted math could be beautiful, that she heard music in equations, and Clara replied that she sounded extraordinary. He agreed, then added, after a pause, that Michelle would have liked her, clarifying with a rough little laugh and a clearing of his throat that he meant as a colleague and a friend. A faint flush rose in Clara's cheeks as she repeated the word friend, tasting it as if it were both simple and complicated at once. 6 months later, Ray stood under a white event tent at the edge of a construction site surrounded by reporters, investors, and city officials for the launch of his first major Build the Michelle Sullivan Initiative, a project of fast-assembled modular homes designed for families priced out of traditional housing. What had begun as Bluey's offhand comment about building blocks had evolved into a system that could be transported, assembled, and adapted in a fraction of the usual time and cost. And as Ray outlined the vision on stage, his words clear and steady, his gaze kept returning to Clara in the front row, standing tall with her hands folded, her expression steady and proud and entirely present for him in that moment. He told the crowd that this initiative existed because someone had chosen to look past a label of failure and instead see potential, because falling down was not the same thing as staying down, and because a single person had given him a second chance long after he had stopped believing he deserved one himself. When he lifted his glass of champagne, still a strange, almost surreal luxury in his hand, he dedicated the toast to second chances and to the people brave enough to offer them. The applause rolled through the tent in a wave that felt less like noise and more like affirmation, and when it quieted, Clara stepped up beside him, took the microphone, and announced that Ray had proposed something new for Nexus, a program called Second Chances, created as a hiring and training pathway for people who had slipped through the cracks, single parents, caregivers stepping back into the workforce after years away, individuals rebuilding careers after grief or illness, anyone whose resume held gaps that usually got them discarded. She declared that Nexus would become the first major company to formalize such a pathway, and expressed her certainty that they would not be the last because someone had to prove it could work. She turned to Ray and told the audience that this was what he did, that he found the cracks and built bridges across them, and for a moment the buzzing room blurred as their eyes met, and all the chaos of the past year narrowed to a single shared understanding. A week later, at their small kitchen table at home, Bluey announced in a matter-of-fact tone, somewhere between observation and verdict, that her father was in love. Ray nearly choked on his pasta while she pointed her fork at him as if it were evidence, explaining that he smiled at his phone whenever Clara's name appeared, that he wore his nice shirts on days when she had meetings with him, and that Clara looked at him the way Mommy used to look at him in the old photos. Something in Ray's chest tightened, a mix of grief for Michelle and gratitude for the unexpected future unfolding in front of them. And he told his daughter gently that her mother had wanted him to be happy, that it was something she had said to him more than once when she was sick. Bluey nodded with the clear-eyed practicality that seemed to be one of her superpowers, and replied that she knew, leaving unspoken but obvious the truth, that a heart big enough to love once could learn how to love again. If Ray and Clara's journey from injustice and grief to purpose, love, and second chances made you feel even a small spark of hope, please like this video, share it with someone who might need a reminder that decency still matters, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss more emotional stories about hidden heroes, quiet acts of courage, and the unexpected ways life gives us another chance when we think our story is over. She told him, with that matter-of-fact wisdom that only children seem to own, that Michelle had once said he carried too much love inside him for just one little girl to hold it all, and Ray laughed as the words struck something deep in his chest, pulling her into a tight hug while his eyes filled faster than he could blink them clear. He asked her, half teasing and half genuinely stunned, when she had become so wise, and Bluey, completely serious, informed him that it had happened on Tuesday, a reply so perfectly her that he broke into real laughter, the kind that sounded like something new was finally taking root inside him. What changed between Ray and Clara did not begin with fireworks or grand speeches. It unfolded in small, steady moments that seemed ordinary until they looked back and realized those were the places where everything had quietly shifted. There were the late nights spent shoulder to shoulder over whiteboards, solving problems until their coffee went cold and the office lights were the only ones still burning. And the weekend when Clara surprised Bluey with tickets to her first Broadway show because Ray had admitted, almost apologetically, that they had never been able to afford to go. There was the routine that developed without either of them naming it, where Ray left Clara's favorite coffee on her desk each morning with a 20 tucked beneath the cup as a private joke between them, a little echo of the day everything had started, and it somehow never stopped being funny. There was the afternoon after a brutal board meeting when Clara closed her office door, broke down in tears she had been holding back for years, and Ray did the only thing that felt right. He wrapped his arms around her and held her without offering solutions or motivational speeches, simply understanding that sometimes real strength meant allowing yourself to break in front of someone you trusted. There were evenings at his kitchen table when Clara patiently taught Bluey the basics of coding, small fingers tapping keys while Ray watched from the doorway with a look on his face that made Clara's pulse quicken, because it held gratitude, wonder, and something larger that neither of them dared to name. They let it remain unspoken for a long time, as if naming it too soon might scare it away. Grief still cast shadows over Ray's heart, and Clara carried ghosts of her own, so hope felt delicate, precious, almost breakable. The words themselves arrived on an ordinary Thursday that turned itself into something else entirely. Ray had spent the morning pitching an audacious new concept to the board, a paint-on solar technology that could transform entire skylines into silent power generators without altering the appearance of a single building. He walked them through efficiency curves and cost models, his energy quiet but certain, until one director cut in and insisted that the plan was too ambitious, urging him to scale it back, to think smaller, to play safe. Ray had braced himself for the usual corporate retreat. Instead, Clara's voice cut through the room with a clarity that left no room for debate, as she said that they would not be scaling his vision down, that Ray's ambition was exactly what both the company and the world needed, and that sometimes the risk lay in dreaming too small, not in daring to aim higher. She did not look away from him as she said it, and something in that steady gaze wrapped around his heart like a promise. After the meeting, he found her alone in the rooftop garden he had designed, a living system of plants filtering air and raised beds growing herbs and vegetables that now supplied part of the cafeteria. The evening light stretched long shadows across the leaves, and the city's noise blurred into a distant hum. He thanked her for backing the project, but she shook her head and told him that she hadn't been defending a proposal, she had been defending him. Then she drew in a breath that sounded like she was stepping off a ledge, and told him plainly that she was in love with him, that the feeling had been growing since the day she watched him hand his last $20 to a stranger whose card had declined. She loved him because he had chosen kindness when bitterness would have been easier, because he had taught her that strength was not about never falling, but about what you did while you were still on the floor, gathering yourself and finding a way to reach out anyway. Ray closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and cradled her face in his hands, admitting that he had been terrified to let his heart open again, that a part of him had believed loving someone new meant betraying Michelle, as if there were only so much love to go around, and he had already used up his share. He told Clara that he had finally understood something he wished he had grasped earlier, that love is not a ration that runs out but a capacity that grows, that Michelle had taught him how to love completely, and that lesson had not died with her. It had been waiting, patient and quiet, for someone extraordinary enough to carry it forward. It had been waiting for her. Then he kissed her. not with the desperation of someone clinging to a last chance, but with the calm certainty of a man who had finally stopped fighting what his heart already knew. While the garden rustled gently around them and the city hummed below, life itself pushing forward in 1,000 unseen ways. That evening, back in their cozy kitchen, Bluey asked in her usual straightforward style whether Clara was going to be her new mom, pencil hovering over her homework, as if the answer would determine how she filled in the next blank space. Ray almost dropped the plates into the sink in surprise, then recovered enough to joke that maybe they should start with a few official dates before handing out titles. And Bluey, practical as ever, accepted that answer, but advised him to wear the nice shirt when he did. The way she said it made him laugh, and the sound that came out of him was brighter, lighter, the sound not of a man drowning but of someone finally learning to swim again. In the months that followed, the line between meetings and dates blurred so thoroughly that only Bluey seemed to see it clearly. She teased her father about how he suddenly smiled down at his phone whenever Clara's name appeared on the screen, how he reached for his best shirts when he knew he would be seeing her, how Clara's eyes softened in a way that reminded her of the photos of Mommy on the bookshelf. One evening, as they dealt cards for a game at the table, Bluey asked if she could start calling Clara Mama Clara now, and Ray suggested gently that it might be better to talk to Clara first. Bluey rolled her eyes, grinning, and informed him that she already had, that she had asked Clara the previous week when Ray had come home late from a supplier meeting, and that Clara had cried the good kind of tears and said yes, not to replace Mommy, but to add more love to their family. Bluey told him she had replied that it was perfect, because her heart kept getting bigger and needed more people to fill it. Ray hugged his daughter so tightly she squeaked, told her she was amazing, and she reminded him with a smirk that he had already told her that on Tuesday, but that he was welcome to repeat it as often as he liked. A year later, Ray stood inside the same coffee shop where everything had first begun, yet the space felt almost unrecognizable because the story attached to it had changed. On the wall near the counter, a small bronze plaque had been mounted that read, "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest change. Dedicated to those who give, even when they have so little." And Ray traced the words with his eyes for a moment before handing the barista 5 folded $20 bills. Every Monday, without fail, he left them there with the same quiet instruction. For anyone whose card was declined, no questions asked, just a simple, immediate yes. The barista smiled and told him that just yesterday a young mother had come in with 3 kids, that her card had failed, and that she had nearly cried with relief when told her total was already covered. She had left a note for him, shaking handwriting on a small napkin, thanking the unknown stranger who had paid for her coffee, and explaining that he hadn't just salvaged a bad morning, he had rescued her. Hope, because the money she would have spent there had paid for printing her resume, which she needed for a job interview that same day. As Ray read the note, Clara slipped her arms around his waist from behind and rested her chin on his shoulder, whispering that the ripples of that long-ago moment were still spreading farther than either of them could see. 6 months had passed since their wedding. A small rooftop ceremony filled with friends, colleagues, and a very determined flower girl who threw petals with the precision of a scientist calculating coverage. And today, they were preparing to announce something larger than anything they had imagined that first snowy morning. Together, they were about to unveil the global expansion of the Second Chances program. 300 companies had officially signed on, each committing to hiring and training people who were rebuilding their lives after loss, incarceration, caregiving, illness, or any other invisible detour that usually condemned a resume to the rejection pile. The forecast predicted 10,000 new opportunities in the first year alone, 10,000 people given the chance Ray had once thought would never come back around for him. Clara asked if he was ready for the announcement, and Ray pulled her close and told her that he was. But before they stepped out into the waiting cameras and applause, He kissed her right there in that same cafe where she had once been a stranger whose card had declined, and he had been a man with nothing but a single 20 and a heart, trying very hard not to give up. That humble exchange had become the hinge on which his entire life had swung, the moment when choosing generosity and scarcity had rewritten his future. From the doorway, Bluey, now 10, sharp and bright as ever, called out that they were going to be late and reminded them that they had promised she would get to present the youth mentorship portion of the initiative. They laughed and reached for each other's hands, then walked together toward her, toward their daughter, toward a future in which their company had finally accepted that the most transformative investments were not always in technology or patents, but in people, especially those who couldn't yet see their own worth. The cafe door chimed as they stepped out, the same soft bell that had rung 3 years earlier when Ray had quietly slid his final 20 across the counter, and without realizing it, bought himself a new chapter. Behind them at the counter, another man counted his last few bills, anxiety tightening his shoulders as he worried about payday, while ahead of him a woman fumbled with her card, silently begging it not to decline. The barista, now well-practiced in the ritual, reached for the envelope of 20s with a smile that said the outcome had already been decided. The ripples continued, stretching outward in ways none of them would ever fully trace. Love and loss and kindness and hope moving through lives like an unseen current. These moments, Ray had come to understand, were not transactions measured in exact amounts. They were investments whose returns appeared in unexpected forms, in connection, in compassion, in the second, third, and fourth chances that people gave each other just by refusing to look away. Sometimes the person you help when you believe you have almost nothing left becomes the one who helps you remember who you were always meant to be. The most beautiful truth he and Clara had discovered together was that love does not erase what came before. It honors it, then builds something sturdier on top. On their living room mantel, Michelle's photo stood right beside their wedding picture, not pushed aside, not replaced, but included. Because love does not divide. Love multiplies. It gathers broken pieces, scarred hearts, and unfinished stories, and weaves them into something not neat or perfect, but profoundly human. Ray still stopped at that same coffee shop every morning, but he no longer counted his money in fear. He counted his blessings with a kind of quiet awe that never really wore off. Every $20 bill he left behind felt like a love letter, to the moment when losing everything had shown him he still had something priceless to give. He had learned, standing at rock bottom, that it was not the end of the story, but the foundation from which everything new is built, and that sometimes the hand that lifts you up belongs to someone who is just as much in need of being lifted. We rescue each other in ways big and small. One cup of coffee, one quiet act of kindness, one love story that starts with a simple, "Let me help." If this story of Ray, Clara, and Bluey reminded you that even the smallest kindness can change the direction of a life, share it with someone who needs hope today. Hit like so more people can find it. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more long, emotional stories about second chances, unseen goodness, and the power of choosing compassion when it would be easier to walk away.